Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to join while we're waiting. Just make sure to, if you have any questions during the webinar, go ahead and post them in the chat and we'll answer them and work through them as best as possible. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yeah. Well, what's going on? Yeah. Okay.
We've got people joining, so we'll just give it a few more minutes. Probably actually start about, what, 2 minutes after, Thomas?
Sounds like a plan.
Sounds good.
How are you guys doing this morning?
Doing well, thank you.
Excellent.
Doing okay. Testing out the standing desk this morning, so we'll see how that goes.
Nice. I am not. It's too early for me.
Yeah. So if everything comes crashing down, we'll know what happened.
Unlock your knees, James.
So Elton, you got the Sting poster back there. What's your favorite Sting song while we're waiting for everyone to join?
So my favorite Sting song, that's a tough one. Probably off his solo stuff. I like Moon Over Bourbon Street. That's a good one.
Moon Over Bourbon Street. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, it's about a vampire. It's pretty cool.
Oh, well, it's bourbon and vampires? That sounds right up my alley. We can talk about that after we talk about some cloud native security.
Absolutely.
Right.
So it's 10:02. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is James Strong. We're going to be talking about how experts implement cloud native security today. Thomas, you want to go ahead and go to the next slide? So my name is James Strong. I'm the Cloud Native Director here at Contino. I can be found on most social media at StrongJZ. Go ahead, next slide.
I am Thomas Behnken. I am a technical principal here at Contino. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'll be providing the slides and color commentary.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Elton Morrison. I work for Cognizant. I'm the cloud security lead for Cognizant. You can find me on LinkedIn. There's the nice little link. And I'll be providing some background on how Cognizant is leveraging Cloud Guardian.
So about Contino, we are a enterprise DevOps cloud native computing and data platform transformation company. What that means is that we help organizations implement transformation through cloud migrations, adopting DevOps and Agile. 400 plus people, we have 5 global offices, and we've done well over 500 engagements with 250 plus customers. And as of, I think it was October of 2019, right, Elton, that Cognizant acquired Contino, and as part of that acquisition, we've been helping them with their cloud native security practices. You go ahead and go to the next slide. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about the industry challenges with adopting the cloud, some of the security concerns, and lots of the other concerns around adopting the cloud. With that, we're going to give a perspective from a client perspective, where Elton's going to talk about some of the issues that we're facing Cognizant from a security, accountability, and financial perspective. We're going to talk a little bit more about how we implemented cloud security best practices at Cognizant. Then with our framework, we're going to give a little bit of a technical overview, and we're actually going to run a live demo. So Thomas made sure to give a sacrifice to the demo gods today. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I think it is a foregone conclusion when we say that cloud adoption is challenging. There are lots of factors to consider when migrating to the cloud. And at the top of the stack, when we talk to clients, the biggest concern is security. Securing the cloud, making sure that, I think the thing that I hear a lot is we're just terrified of the cloud. I actually have a quote from a client saying, everyone here is terrified of S3 because of the security, data the data leakage issues that come with S3. We all see those security concerns and challenges. And of course, compliance. We have, when we're working on-prem, we have a lot of control over what's there. We have complete control of the stack, complete control of compliancy. And when we move to the cloud, there's lots of other issues when we are trying to impose on-premise thinking into the cloud. And of course, we all need to know and understand what's running from a financial perspective, from an audit perspective in the cloud. As always, the cloud should be considered another software product, which includes access management. So there's lots of security, there's lots of concerns from that perspective when migrating to the cloud. And it feels like each piece needs its own solution, needs to have some kind of concern from that perspective. So with that, let me go ahead and go to the next slide. We talk a little bit more about some of those challenges. We put out surveys both from an industry perspective, and Contino has their cloud report from 2020, and we looked at some of the concerns. 48% of respondents said that security is their top concern from that perspective. And of course, compliance leads up from a 37%. And when deploying to the cloud and trying to set up the cloud, one of the biggest cost issues, one of the biggest issues that we see is cloud misconfiguration. And if individuals had put up a fully automated security system, the savings could be around $3.5 million from that perspective. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And I think we've all seen a lot of the cloud misconfigurations around things like public S3 buckets with data dumps that shouldn't just be there. From an understanding of what those can do from a breach, an audit perspective, a personal brand perspective, it has detriments, and it also has financial ramifications over $500,000 in some instances. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So with that, we understand that there are lots of issues from cloud migrations, cloud adoptions, and we're going to talk a little bit about those from a Cognizant perspective. So with that, Elton, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Thank you, James. Next slide, please, Thomas.
Sure.
So from a Cognizant perspective, and with any large global organization, the challenges are very similar, right? So when Cognizant adopted cloud, they did a rapid cloud adoption, right? Well, what that means is when we move into the cloud rapidly, in some cases there were lack of formal controls, there were lack of central governance, guidelines and policies. So really what we ended up with was, a large scope of cloud environments that were really unmanaged or unknown in some cases. And also when you look at the vendors, the controls and services provided sometimes are very similar, but also they're unique. So from an Azure and AWS perspective, AWS out of the box or default configuration, not really enterprise focused like Azure is when you look at what they're doing. So you'll see just an example of some of the numbers that we've seen from our perspective of the scope of that problem. A large number of environments that are outside of central governance, central management, central controls applied. So we really looked at that scope of the problem and then define what our risks and challenges were from a business and security standpoint. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Thomas. So really, what does that lead to? You can see from the bullet points here, decentralized account subscription and structure. We had some accounts that were centralized, we had good control over, others we did not. People getting sandbox innovation environments, putting them on a corporate card just to do some testing, support certification training, or just learning an environment, right? Hey, I've never done anything in AWS. I'm going to go get an environment and let's just play with this. Let's see what happens. Well, that leads to some risk as well. Also, you got account sprawl and subscription sprawl from that standpoint. You end up getting exponentially more subscriptions in cloud environments created that you're unaware of. That leads to a lack of visibility into these environments. And from visibility, there's really a multiple factors, not just a security standpoint as well, but IT operations and financial visibility. From a security standpoint, making sure your operations teams and your logging and monitoring solutions are centralized and configured for those environments. Security operations teams, incident response teams, governance teams, you name it. The ability to provide that visibility is really key to getting your hands around that problem, understanding what's going on. And then also you'll see gaps in your security implementation, controls either not implemented or implemented in an inconsistent manner, right? And then finally, there's not the knowledge gap, right? There's so much to learn in the cloud. It's kind of overwhelming when you first dive in. There's so many different services, PaaS and SaaS and IaaS and EC2s, and you start to look at just the number of services that are out there, and that knowledge gap can lead to, again, additional risk areas. As James noted, people are scared to death of S3 because they don't understand sometimes when they deploy that. Is that public facing? Is it not public facing? So they really start to deploy things not knowing the risks of what they're doing. So really we needed to find a solution that kind of puts our arms around that problem, starts to give us that visibility, bring in our account subscriptions for all, and start to implement those controls in a consistent manner and in a way that the business can still operate and function as they need to. So next slide, please. So when you start to look at the landscape of cloud security tools that are out there, there's a lot of tools, and there's some very, very good tools out there. If you go to the next slide, you'll see just an example of some of the tools that we looked at from a Cognizant perspective. Prisma Cloud is a Palo Alto product. It has two functions: cloud security posture management, workload protection management. That's an excellent tool. It does some very good things. Fugue is a similar tool, and also Divi Cloud. Divi Cloud is also a very popular tool. People are familiar with that. Again, cloud security posture management, workload protection management, providing that visibility, providing the ability to audit the security controls, and also audit against compliance frameworks like NIST and HIPAA, CIS, etc. The problem with the tools, though, is there's always gaps in what your business requirements are and what's available in those tools. So what we needed to do was find a way to fill those gaps and leverage those in conjunction with additional third-party tools. The other thing I'll say about some of these tools is they are reactive, meaning you will find the security gaps after they've already been implemented, as opposed to a proactive solution where you can do it out of the box. We know, how do we get to a point where someone deploys a cloud environment and those controls are there by default? That way we know it's a known good state that they start from. And then from a compliance and monitoring governance standpoint, how do we measure the drift, right? How do we know if they've changed something or if they've added a new service that we maybe haven't looked at yet, but they're testing it? What are the risks in that area? So it's really a combination of what we partnered with on Contino for the Cloud Guardian standpoint, as well as the third-party tools. Next slide, please. Again, so none of those tools achieved exactly what we wanted to do. That's why we went to Contino. We partnered with them and started leveraging the Cloud Guardian framework. Next slide, please. And Thomas,
yeah, awesome. So with all that in mind, we began looking at what would the right solution look like, right? So we took a standard Contino principled approach where we set about laying out the defining pillars that we wanted to build this on. So we targeted something that was lightweight and mobile, right? So meaning that we could move pieces around within it, but that it was easily deployable and not super costly. And we went for something highly opinionated. That is another Contino staple that Cognizant shared with us and partnered on to make this the thing that we wanted, the thing that was going to work for the specific items that we identified. And then to push the scalable idea that this wasn't going to fall over if we put too much pressure on it, right? This was designed for something much larger than one or two accounts. We wanted to make sure that it was going to work. We also wanted the ability to measure the output and the activities that were being performed by the solution. We wanted a holistic approach. We didn't want a reactive solution or a very pointed solution. We wanted something that encompassed everything that we could do and wanted to do. And then we wanted something proven. We wanted something that when we did it and we showed it and we implemented it, we knew that it accomplished what we set out to do. And we had the measurements, the proof, and everything in place. So that brings up Cloud Guardian. Cloud Guardian, go ahead.
I was going to say, so what is Cloud Guardian, Thomas? Because I think Elton's mentioned it a couple times.
Yeah. So what is Cloud Guardian? This is our, I'm not going to read from the slide. Cloud Guardian is an accelerator framework that we have partnered with Cognizant to deploy and implement that leverage their existing investments and implementations and reached out to enforce those consistency and security financial controls. But in layman's terms, basically they knew what they wanted and they had already spent money and effort to get there, but just weren't there yet. So how could we build something that integrated with all of that? And that's what Cloud Guardian is that framework that allows us to piece all that together and then accelerate it up to the next level. So we began looking at the different components of cloud, and particularly the guardrails and things you would want to wrap around cloud and the cloud migration journey and who's using it. So you'll see on this slide security and the CISO, the CISO, but you also have development and finance, the users of the cloud, the people who manage what it's paid for, the CIO and CTO who are less interested maybe in the specific security concerns, but those outcomes that result from them. They may not care about 100 different security controls until one isn't implemented. And so that's where we took this Cloud Guardian approach to wrap everything into a single container. And James, can you maybe explain what I'm looking at here on this framework slide?
Yeah, Thomas, thank you for that. So a lot of learning goes on when you're doing a cloud migration, when you're doing a cloud adoption. And what we've done here from a framework perspective, is we've bucketed those learnings into steps to help implement the framework. It's very similar when you look at cloud service providers. You know, AWS has their cloud adoption framework. I'm sure Azure has one as well. So Thomas is our Azure expert. He can comment on that. But we wanted to make sure that we were hitting all of the high notes from each one of those and putting security first. So when you look at the first step on the left, far corner there, we do an assessment from a cloud security perspective, understanding, the first question I ask, and I think Elton was, provided it right off the bat, was, what is your cloud security standard? Is there a cloud security standard? What does it look like? And if you don't have one, let's work through that and get that together, because we need to understand, what does secure mean to you? Each client's requirements are different, provided, different regulatory requirements, different compliance requirements. There's lots of other reasons what a client would consider secure. And so understanding what that means before we even get into talking about implementation details, software, things like that, we need to understand, what does secure mean to them? Once we've done that and we've understood that problem, we go into identity and access management, because that's one of the biggest concerns that we see from a security perspective. Who's doing what, when, and where, and how do we accomplish this from a holistic perspective? Because it's not just one cloud, there's a multi-cloud strategy, there's hybrid cloud strategies. So we need to be able to understand, how are we going to access that? And, for the most part, the industry standard is, SAML, SSO. So how do we implement that across the clouds from that perspective? Does it answer the security concerns that we have, that we've already identified in the previous step? And once we've identified those needs, we go into what we call security as code, right? We want to look to how to implement those security guardrails. And it's not just from a security perspective. We're talking about IAM, networking, a plethora of other services. How do we secure approved services in the cloud? How do we get them approved? And working through and getting that workflow together to understand how we can enable developers while making security, and we make the cloud account secure and compliant. Basically, so that Elton can sleep at night instead of getting 5 hours of sleep.
That's right.
Once we've started identifying those, we work with or help identify and build up a cloud center of excellence, because a cloud migration is, not as effective if there's not a governance body, there's not an organization within the organization that can help set these standards. So working with them throughout the previous 3 steps, we want to put this out there into the organization, understanding what it means to have a secure account, a secure cloud account. And then of course, all of this is implemented as software. So we have software that helps implement all of the previous 3 steps. So doing the deployment, making sure that everything is being tested. So when we say, yes, this service is secure, we have developers testing it. We have business analysts testing it, trying to make sure that it does meet the security requirements that we've looked to implement. And of course, while we're doing all of this, no change inside of an organization is complete without marketing this idea, because this will change how organizations access the cloud, how it gets managed, and how the developers will use and implement their services in the cloud. So that part of any change requires, marketing and selling the idea from that perspective. So from a holistic point of view, we wanted to take the idea of what is needed to secure cloud accounts and broke it up into these buckets. Elton, did I miss anything from those steps perspective?
No, but I'd like to add from a marketing standpoint and just really the framework itself, what you're looking at is, depending on the organization, this could actually be a cultural change for how we operate in the cloud, right? So it really changes the mindset of a lot of folks of what cloud is and how do I operate in the cloud, how do I deploy in the cloud, how do I develop in the cloud, how do I go to production in the cloud, and it really becomes a cultural change, and it's a nice journey for the teams because they begin to understand what cloud is, how is it different from on-prem, how do I move design patterns that I've used on-prem possibly and modify those to work in cloud native environments, right? So this whole journey really ends up being a cultural change for organizations when it comes to cloud operations, cloud engineering, and cloud deployments.
And
I was going to say, I completely agree. Go ahead, Thomas.
yeah, no worries. Talking over each other. I was going to add a piece about the identity and access management, because in recent conversations I've had with people, there's usually a surprise that it's so early on in the process. But it really is a crucial foundational aspect of the framework when you're looking at things from like an authorization, authentication level. But the most important piece that is often overlooked, like people say, well, we use Azure AD or we use some other identity provider, is the auditing component of the 3 A's of IAM. And how do you know who is logging in to your cloud accounts? And how can you record and report on that when an incident happens? So I just think that's an important piece that sometimes gets overlooked.
Yeah, I think the big thing there is that when we say IAM, most people think it's the end user, the developer, or the business analyst that have access to it. But a lot of the things that we've talked about too is visibility. So for having, security or incident response teams having access to cloud accounts, again, knowing what's happening inside those accounts, that's also part of the discussion as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, go to the next slide. So as with all Contino engagements, what we look at is what are the outcomes we are trying to achieve. And through implementing this framework, these are some of the things that we looked at trying to implement from this perspective and what we can see implementing this for other clients. So the first one is automation. With this framework, we have a complete set of CI/CD principles and framework for implementing not only the security controls, but the software that also runs and establishes the APIs and all of the containers and everything that is needed to required to set this framework up. We have secure account deployment by design. We say by design because the first step in this process is understanding what the security requirements are, having that conversation with security, the identity and access management teams, financial controls, everything that's required to consider account to be secure. We say modular development and maintenance because of the way in which we've designed, which we'll go more into when we get into the technical overview, is that as things are needed, as security, regulation, compliance, as those evolve, because they change daily, new CVEs, new services, new updates to services, we need to be able to respond rapidly. So being able to have a modular development and maintenance, and with an automated CI/CD framework, we have a way to push out new changes and updates to the environments. Leverages third-party custom and open source components We'll talk more about that when we get into the technical overview. The biggest thing here is that at the heart of this is Terraform. Since this is a multi-cloud API, we need to be able to have a level set of how do we secure a cloud account. So once we have an understanding of what secure means, we need to be able to then go into the implementation details of how to achieve that. And one of the best tools for that is Terraform. It's an API, so any third-party tool or CMDB ticketing system, like ServiceNow, for example, we need to be able to have that as the workflow management and then have the API talk to it and set up those cloud accounts from that perspective. We say improved user experience because this gives the development teams more access to the cloud, gives them the ability to experiment and innovate, again, while maintaining that security and compliance, so that they don't have to think about it, and the security team has a way to understand what is happening inside of those accounts. It's an enforcement and compliance with security standards, because as we've said, and as we've talked about previously, security is at the forefront of all of this, and understanding how we implement those and get those into the accounts. We want to say granular control, because as we all know, working in the cloud, working with IAM and an AWS perspective, we can get very granular around the API requirements from that perspective. This is all codified as part of the standards in place. And then ultimately, we have cloud security. We have peace of mind that we're not going to have a data leakage. We have an understanding of how we implement cloud security. And I think everyone just seems a little bit more at peace. I don't know, Elton, is that a little too much? Is that a little too pie in the sky?
No, so one of the other things I wanted to mention here is we focus obviously on security. My role is security. But one of the other things we found in the framework is you get additional benefits from using the automation, the Terraform, you know, the workflow management, et cetera. With the automation, you also get other improvements as well in IT operations, for example, in the visibility piece of it, as we talked about. So it really becomes a better user experience, because the thing that we're always trying to balance in security is how much security is too much, and then the users go around what you're trying to do because it's just too hard to use, right? So from the Cloud Guardian framework standpoint and the automation, the experience for the user is actually much better. It's automated. Everything's done for them in the background. They'll submit their service request to whatever ticketing system that you choose, and then Cloud Guardian does its thing in the background, and then they're provided with a secure base environment, a foundational environment they can work in. So from their standpoint, a user perspective, it's definitely a better user experience, and we still have the controls in place we need. Operations is a little bit smoother as well from an IT standpoint. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you, James.
And I think we looked at it from so as part of our engagements, we always do a value stream mapping to try to understand what is the current state. And I think what we looked at and what we saw is that it was a day SLA, it was all manual, and it had no security controls. They were just given access to an account, and they were able to do some of the things that we didn't want them to be able to do. So with this framework, one of the outcomes is that it was fully automated. I think the SLA we looked at from an average perspective is maybe 20 minutes, Thomas.
Yeah,
I think we've seen some of them faster, but it's not a 24-hour turnaround perspective.
Right.
And from an automation perspective, it sets it up, and it's kind of like set it and forget it. The API request runs everything, and we are able to give them a secure environment. And I don't know where I was going with the end.
Well, I was going to say the other thing it does is it level sets the maturity level for an organization. With any large organization, you're going to find different levels of maturity when it comes to some of the technology. Some teams are going to adopt cloud and operate very well, very high maturity level in operations in cloud. Other teams are new to that environment, and maybe they're not as mature in how they deploy and how they secure their environments. What the Cloud Guardian framework does, it kind of level sets that maturity level and gives them a foundational environment they can start to build upon. And we know from day one that certain controls are in place, and we know they can't do certain things. So it does provide, a nice environment for folks to, level set on that maturity level. So that's an important point as well.
And I would think that it also enforces the idea of do what you know and buy what you don't. This allows developers to develop or users to use the cloud in ways they know how, and not require them to learn how to manage the cloud, right? So, and teams, security teams or AD teams that might want to come in and you need to do X in your cloud account, the user no longer has to worry about that. They don't need to worry about how to define IAM policies or how to implement CloudTrail logging for AWS or network watchers for Azure. Those things are implemented through automation and allowing that user to focus on their job, not on the things that are required to do their job.
Exactly. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Thomas. So we're going to go a little bit more in detail from a technical overview perspective. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So from this perspective, it all starts with a ticketing system, a workflow perspective, right? Because we want to make sure that the financial controls and the project controls, the audits are in place, and we didn't want to implement that workflow because we understood that it was going to be different per client. So the assumption is once we've gotten an API request, that workflow has been approved from a financial perspective, from a director's perspective, and it's all taken care of from the workflow. Now, this is also part of the discussion and understanding what does it mean, to have a cloud account. This also gives us an audit point. We're saying, well, this project already has 3 AWS accounts. Why does it need a 4th? And they have to give that justification. So we wanted to make sure that all of that was taken care of in the workflow in the ticketing system. But once that has been determined, it's been approved, the API request has been set up, depending on the user's input, will depend on the level of security that we implement from the guardrails perspective. So we want to make them modular in design so that we can say for a development account or a sandbox account, we're going to implement, guardrails 7 through 8, and maybe only in production, we're going to implement, guardrails 2 through 3. So we want to be able to do that and determine that information from the user's input. And that's where we get into the guardrails perspective. Those guardrails are implemented as part of Terraform modules that allow us to, based on the user's input, again, what cloud they're wanting to run, so AWS, Azure, GCP, effectively anything that Terraform would support, we can most likely out of the box be able to implement those guardrails. And of course, we can always write some Python scripting or some PowerShell scripting, right, Thomas?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then once that's been decided, the Terraform has been generated based on the user's input from the API. We then apply that to the cloud service provider. Go ahead and go to the next slide where we dig a little bit deeper into that. Thomas, you want to go ahead and talk a little bit through this one?
Sure. So we'll go number by number, right? So at the top of the screen, we have the API, which in this implementation here resides in AWS through the Elastic Kubernetes service. So we deployed the microservices required to do what we wanted there. And within that, we have a REST point, a series of endpoints and routes that we can hit for various functions. And that then takes the user request in and runs it through the Terraform that James was mentioning, right? And then there's a series of SQS queues to handle messaging and communication back and forth, where it then moves into applying guardrails, right? So you can see on the screen, GitLab can be used, but any code repo can be used and pulled down. And then it moves in, we apply aspects of the IAM controls necessary per cloud provider. So those are based on whether or not we're going to do SAML federation, maybe with Azure AD and AWS, or if it's GCP or any of that. We then provision the account, right? And you're going to see that later in the demo. It's pretty quick, and it adds it into what some people might know as a landing zone. That's part of the framework itself beyond the application piece. And then the rest of it is getting into a processor or a messaging end result. We call it the post processor. And that has a few functions where it stores information in the database that can be audited, but it also returns messaging back to the request system, which you see here is labeled as ServiceNow, but it can really be anything that has an API that can be hit and updated.
So some of the other things from like a downstream system, like Elton was talking about previously, and this is the part where we talk about the investment that you've already made in maybe a cloud security posture management tool like Prisma Cloud. We can let those systems know from a downstream perspective that they now need to monitor or do whatever that they need to talk to that system, so that they're aware that that cloud account now exists. It helps complete that loop and bring in the tools that you've already invested in.
Right. And you could have maybe a guardrail that triggers a Lambda or an Azure function that sends off an email or sends off an SMS message, or updates Prisma Cloud with a new account, right? And so to James's point.
And so that's why we have those things in blue. Those are the client components when we talk about this. So from an implementation perspective, we're putting together a conversation around what needs to happen. These are the pieces that are unique to the client. So we have Azure on there because with Cognizant, we implemented it with Azure AD. It could be Okta, I think any SAML provider from that perspective. The cloud, so even if you're only provisioning to one cloud at this point, you still have the ability using this framework to implement those security guardrails to enable developers to test out using other cloud frameworks. And I think one of the things that we got a lot while we were doing this from a development perspective is why Kubernetes, why containers, why not using Lambda, why not using these things? We wanted to be able to not be concerned around like a timing perspective, because sometimes Terraform, we set 20-minute SLA, depending on the level of security, the level of guardrails, it could run longer than what a Lambda function could do. And instead of ECS from that perspective, since we're using AWS, we use EKS because the idea is that we wanted to be able to pull components in. So some of the ideas from a future perspective is being able to deploy this as an operator, and then just being able to deploy this to whatever Kubernetes cluster you're running from a client's perspective. So again, that modularity in design with future proofing.
Yeah, if I can speak to the modularity as well, we mentioned the integration of third-party tools. As we know in a third-party space, some tools, if you look like a Gartner Magic Quadrant, they'll become better as they move through their development and maturity cycles for a particular project. So let's say you're using like DB Cloud for your CSPM module, and in 6 months there's a decision at the business level to change that. Let's go to something else. The modular nature of the frameworks allows you to make those changes even with your third-party components that are integrated here. So that allows you to adapt to the business needs, the requirements, and use best of breed from a third-party tool perspective as well. So that modularity really helps you to stay on top of what's best of breed when you're integrating your third-party projects, even from a request service standpoint, right? ServiceNow is listed here, but let's say you go to another tool in 6 months, there's a business change to change that. We're going to adopt a new framework here. It's really a simple change from the modularity standpoint. The API doesn't change. It's just the point that you're hitting and where it's coming from that changes for you. So the modularity really helps to keep the environment up to date from a tools perspective and from a business standpoint as well.
And the same thing from a cloud security practice perspective. If a lot of the times we get a question, I was like, why not just use Control Tower? I mean, well, that's AWS specific. There are other things, and it also doesn't have an API currently, right? As we say, with each cloud provider, they get better and better, and we can just integrate and either reduce our dependency on, software that the client has written or the software that we've written, and put that burden more on the cloud provider. So again, it's all a question of what is the current need, what's the current ask, and being able to implement that in this perspective, giving us that flexibility.
And from a guardrail standpoint, we've said that name a few times, guardrails. Those controls, they are still leveraging the cloud vendor, provided services, right? So we're just using Terraform to flip those switches in the cloud service provider to turn on those services, right? So if you look at a solution like Control Tower, that's what Control Tower is doing anyway, but it's really AWS specific. We've taken that up a level, right, which you've done here with Cloud Guardian, and really done that across multiple vendors for cloud. So we're still leveraging the cloud native controls. We're just implementing those things with the Terraform so that it's modular and something that can be updated outside of a specific vendor.
And that's actually a good segue into what guardrails are. Thomas, you want to go to the next slide? Unless you have something you wanted to add before. before we do?
That's fine. Yeah, I was about to go into this.
Okay.
So yeah, so what is a guardrail, right? So it is as the slide says, a codified implementation of a security standard. So you might have large corporations a lot of times will have long, very well orchestrated documentation on what the security standards are, but very little in the way of how they're implemented and how do we audit them. So the answer to that from a Cloud Guardian framework standpoint is this guardrail. It is a module that deploys infrastructure or some type of coded implementation to secure a standard or to secure an account around a standard. It creates an audit point. We know this goes back to that proven and measurable principles that we talked about earlier. Not only do we know the guardrail is implemented, we can go and look somewhere because we have the implementation that did it. And because of that, we also know where in the cloud account or in a database or in a ServiceNow or a Prisma that we can go and look at, right? And finally, what that ends up doing is that long document that had all those written standards at the beginning now becomes an automated compliance as code, as it says here, where you press a button or you make a request and your security standard gets applied without a lot of human intervention, without a lot of questions and red tape and bureaucracy. What would you say to that, James? Does that encompass it?
Yeah, that does. One of the things too, we talk a lot about security and identity and access management, but it also is just base what's needed to set up the account, right? A guardrail can be provisioning the account. A guardrail can be setting up the networking rules from that perspective, enforcing, whatever we have determined from those previous steps, what's needed to be done. So it can be, setting up transit gateways, enforcing VPNs. So it's not just the security controls or the SCPs from an AWS perspective. It's everything that's needed to go from, request to wanting an account to being able to log into the account. So all of those steps in between. I don't know what number you guys are at currently, but I think the last time we talked, we were up to about 54 guardrails.
That's about right.
Yeah. And yeah, to that point, it could be financial, like it could be tagging standards that could be in place. What it also allows, because they're modules, they can be applied one at a time usually. The idea is if you already have a landing zone, say, right, that you don't need that provisioning aspect, but you really need CloudTrail implemented or Network Watcher, like I mentioned before for Azure. You can code those guardrails and then apply apply that to your landing zone infrastructure. So it's not just the framework allows for a very modular application and deployment of guardrails. So it doesn't have to be an all-in-one solution.
And I think one of the things that we also had to discuss while we were looking at this is migrating older accounts. So what are the guardrails that we want to implement on older accounts, but not break the workloads? So there are guardrails like enforcing encryption on S3 or EBS volumes. That would break from a older accounts perspective. And so this is part of the testing with the developers is either, applying it to an older account, the guardrails that wouldn't break, and getting them used to that security perspective and giving them time and creating a new account for them so that they can understand the migration path from an unsecure account to a secure account. So part of that is also part of the marketing and the testing aspect, making, again, that change in the organization from understanding how to run cloud accounts securely.
Right.
Go ahead and go to the next slide.
So yeah, so go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
That's all right. So continuing that, like, what are some example guardrails? And I know we mentioned a lot before, and these are not all cloud counts, right? So like the first one is restrict root account. That is a very AWS specific thing, where a root account is an aspect of how you create an AWS account, how you manage an AWS account. And you may not want users who are just the operators of the account to have access to the power that is root in AWS. You might have something that enforces password policies. And again, it's in the saying that it's codified, maybe that's an actual password policy you implement, but that could also be represented by codifying SAML federation with your AD backend, because some AD team, an existing expense and investment that you've already made as a corporation to manage your AD can now be leveraged to manage AWS password policies, right? Centralized roles. James spoke on this earlier, making sure that billing and auditing and maybe your TVM team has access into these new accounts. You increase that audibility and report surface to be able to respond more effectively to incidents. One hot topic is the restriction of common access ports. Basically, cloud's already out on the internet. We're going to put more stuff out on the internet. How do we keep the internet from remoting into our cloud accounts, or our web servers, or Kubernetes clusters, right? CSP logging. I keep talking about auditing, and it's a huge aspect that we focus on. We want to make sure that those logs are enabled by default, can't be tampered with, and are encrypted. So rolling out those types of things might be great examples of just basic foundational guardrails to put on a cloud account. I mentioned Network Watcher a few times for Azure. So networking logs, making sure you have at least an audit trail of who's accessing your cloud account and when. And then again, validate and encrypt your logs. Make sure they can't be tampered with. Make sure that they're accurate and applicable to what you're looking at. Any other examples or anything you want to add, James or Elton?
So again, going back to the original problem statement and some of the risk areas that we saw, the visibility issue, those are solved with the guardrails. We talked about automating, centralized roles, accessing the environment by default for billing teams, security teams, IT operations teams. We have the ability to do that via automation, which really solves your visibility problem. Also, leveraging cloud native, services for the organizational controls, enterprise controls, how these are organized into, organizational units for AWS or management groups for Azure. So those are other examples of foundational guardrails. You can define that enterprise structure, multi-account structure by default with the guardrails. That really helps solve some of the core problems that most large organizations have. And again, the automation and the front end for the users is a better experience, and they really prefer to use that as opposed to going on their own to get their own cloud environment, right? So really the guardrails, again, I talked about not just the security benefits of it, but also the operational and user experience as well is greatly improved.
I think this helps frame the conversation of why we decided it'd be a framework, because a lot of this is a conversation around what are the concerns that the organization has, from all of those aspects that we've talked about, and making sure that those are addressed so that we can allow the development teams of the business analysts to innovate. That's the biggest thing. We don't want to stifle innovation, but we need to make sure it's secure. And that's why we have the conversations up front before we even do any software development, any Terraform modules development. It has to be a conversation, because a lot of the times, like I said, I'll ask, and what's the cloud security standard, and there isn't one. So it's prompting the organization, to have this conversation, and then implementing them as guardrails. I think with that, we can go to the next slide.
Yep.
So we've been doing a lot of talking, and at this point now, Thomas is going to demo this for us.
What? Okay.
Oh, I didn't tell you? Oh, good luck.
Oh, how much? So it looks like we have around 11 minutes left, and that would be really concerning if Cloud Guardian wasn't awesome. So I'm on a Mac, so I'm gonna do some swiping. And for those who have seen something like this before, this is Postman. So I'm gonna launch the API request from this. And we talked about it before. We're gonna create an Azure subscription named CG Crusher 527. 527 doesn't mean anything, it's the date. it's more important that we know that it's the crusher, right? And to do a little pre-proof, right?
Mhm.
This is the Azure portal that we're going to build it in. This is the tenant, right? Just showing that there isn't a CG crusher available here. And these are going to be the magical logs. So I'm going to kick those off. Cloud Guardian in this current deployment is deployed with 3 separate microservices. One is what we call the API, that's that REST endpoint. One is what we call the Terraform worker. That is what does the workhorse work. And then one is the post processor that I mentioned earlier that handles that backend stuff. So we're gonna get those logs running so we can take a look at those.
So where do I get where does all of that information for the API come from?
So if this was in production and deployed, a user would go into ServiceNow or Remedy or whatever front end you're using for tickets, and they would fill out a form or some type of request mechanism that's been put in place, and that will format. We will work with that team to make sure that the form is then translated into this information you see here that Cloud Guardian requires to do its job. Does that answer your question, James?
Yep.
Awesome. So, 9 minutes. We better get going. So let's kick it off, right? So first off, we get a little 200 here. That just means that we're okay, like it says, and they're all green. In the API itself, we see that we have create account request for CG Crusher 527. All right. Now, what's happening in the background is we mentioned the queues, the SQS queues that handle messaging between these services. The API has received this request. It has then translated that request into a new JSON message that Terraform worker needs to do its job. And it's then putting it out on the queue, and then you'll see these messages up here in pink where it's checking the queue routinely to make sure there's nothing there. Once it finds something, it gets to work. So it goes through the Terraform and it launches. So what it does here is it inits. If you don't know what Terraform speak is for that, that's basically it compiles all the code necessary to build what it needs to build. It plans it out and then it applies it, right? So what we're watching right now is the actual subscription being created, right? So any questions about this right now, Elton, James? You guys have seen this work before. Maybe not this cleanly, but.
No, I'm good from my end.
So
Again,
this is going to take a minute. Go ahead.
With the way that we've set this up, we can be able to scale out each of these components as needed. So if we needed to be able to, again, have more post-processor work, we allow the cloud to do that. We allow Kubernetes to manage that scale for us from that perspective. So we see, there you go. I'll let Thomas take it away, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. James has done this demo before too. He might know something about it. So yeah, we saw the subscription create, and then what we're seeing over here is Terraform, the post processor getting its message saying, hey, we had a subscription created, what do we do next? So the post processor knows that the next step is to apply guardrails. So it's going to create another request to put out on SQS for the Terraform worker, and then send over a new type of request, not a subscription create, but an apply guardrails to the account, right? And so we'll see here in the API that the request was received to apply guardrails to account ID, and if we look, it's the same ID, right? So post processor does some SQS stuff, API gets it, and now we have a new message that's going to be coming through the Terraform worker to apply guardrails. Oh, look, there it is.
So
right?
Thomas, I think at this point, right, it should show up in the subscription portal.
Sure will. So let's take, while this is applying guardrails, let's go take a look. So, oh, it's not there. So let's refresh, right? That's an Azureism. And look, Cloud Guardian Crusher 527. We can even go look. For those familiar with Azure, Azure now composes everything in resource groups. They have for a while, but that wasn't always the case. So if you've been an Azure, person a long time, you might recognize that. But we have no resource groups created at the moment because this is just a blanket subscription, right? We just created it. We can go in and look at some basics though, like IAM. and go look at role assignments. So we have some basic role assignments. You'll see management groups. This was put into a specific management group based on, which is innovation, based on some parameters provided. And it inherits a lot of this stuff from that management group. So some of the guardrails, we talked about it being a framework, right? Some of the guardrails are codified through the deployment of the landing zone itself. So various groups and maybe Azure policies, or in case of AWS organizations and service control policies that can be inherited down to subscriptions and accounts.
Yeah, and to that point, Thomas, again, we're leveraging cloud native services to provide the controls. We're not developing these one-offs, right? So as the vendors themselves improve the ability to implement security controls, we can leverage that in this framework, right? So let's say there's an update to management groups or Azure policy, we can take advantage of that with these guardrails and apply them. So they don't show up as unique guardrails that are custom coded, right? They're actually the cloud native services, and we're using Terraform to flip those switches in the vendors themselves. So that's a good point as well.
Yep. And so what we're seeing over here is various guardrails. Now they're obfuscated or abstracted away by numbers. So we call them like 14 and 15 and 24. It's like reading the code in the matrix. We don't see the guardrail numbers anymore. We see Network Watcher or CloudTrail or whatever. So we can possibly, I'm not sure if one's completed yet. Yeah, actually. So before, when we saw no resource groups, Terraform is going through and deploying resource groups for flow logs and Event Hub logging to secure this account further. And what we should see here in a minute is a completion. But I keep bouncing back and forth, so I'm gonna leave it on the Azure screen for a minute and talk about some of the various components. So we had one of the parameters we passed was this concept of an AD group, and we do this for AWS and Azure to allow access. So I have God mode in this tenant, but this test group, you'll notice it's specific to this resource, and so is this owner piece, right? Because that's the parameters that were passed that allow anyone within this AD group now has access to this subscription. So they can log into the Azure portal if they're a member of this tenant and get and view the subscription, access the subscription as a contributor, right? And we can do various policies, custom roles, right? We do that a lot on the AWS side because of the AWS deals with roles a lot differently than Azure does. So.
Yeah, the important point here is also because we're able to leverage whatever backend identity and authentication system you have, you got an operational improvement now as well, because you already have that team set up. They're doing AD, they're doing group management, they're doing identity management. We're simply extending that into the cloud environment. You don't have to create a new team that does cloud identity, right? So this is also not just a security implementation, but also an operational improvement as well. You don't have a new team that just does cloud identity for AWS, for example. You're already leveraging your existing team's processes, security policies for that identity system, identity provider, and they're just extended into the cloud. So this is a good example of not just a security improvement, but an operational improvement as well.
I
Excellent.
totally agree, because at this point, if Thomas was, the lead architect on my team and he's already provisioned the account and AD group is already there, from my perspective as a new developer, all I have to do is request access to the AD group from the already pre-set up rules that the organization has, and I automatically have access to this secure account from that perspective.
Yeah, another point is decommissioning, right? Someone leaves your company, you no longer have to go in and, hey, does this person have an AWS environment? Do they have an Azure environment? Your standard offboarding processes, because you're integrated with an identity provider, when they leave the company, their identity gets deleted. They no longer have access to those environments either. So there's another operational improvement. There's not a separate process for decommissioning and offboarding employees. That's part of your process because it's already there.
Right. Exactly. Thomas, I don't think we're going to be able to show the completion of the run. Oh, it's already done. So you should be able to go off and use this. But we're about at time. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you all for coming today. Any closing words, Thomas, Elton?
Yeah, just you saw how quick it ran, and it's a collaborative approach, and it truly is a framework, not just a piece of software that we plug and play.
Yeah, thank you everybody for attending and taking the time to hear what we're talking about here with Cloud Guardian. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.